true Walmart horror stories. These aren't just strange encounters. These are real stories from people who experienced something terrifying while working or shopping at Walmart late at night. Each story will make you think twice before stepping into a near-empty store after midnight. Story No One. The Smiling Stranger. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unnatural glow over the empty aisles of the supermarket. It was 1:07 a.m., and the store was nearly deserted. A few late-night shoppers wandered aimlessly, their carts half-filled with random items, but otherwise, the place was quiet. Too quiet. Emily hated working the closing shift. The long, empty aisles stretched into the distance like a maze, and the buzzing of the lights did something to her nerves. But tonight, something felt different. Something felt wrong. She was in aisle 12, stacking cans of vegetables onto the shelves when she first noticed him. At first, she thought he was just another customer. A tall, thin man in a dirty gray hoodie, standing at the far end of the aisle. But he wasn't moving. He wasn't shopping. He was just staring at her. A chill crawled up her spine. "Sir, can I help you?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. The man didn't blink, didn't move. He just stood there, his face partially obscured by the shadows of his hood. And then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. It was too wide, too forced, like someone trying to mimic human emotion, but failing. Emily's breath hitched. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the cans in front of her. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She could feel his eyes on her, boring into her back. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, growing closer. Emily's hands trembled as she grabbed her cart and hurried to the next aisle, her heart pounding in her chest. She found her manager, Ron, at the self-checkout area. He was leaning against a register, scrolling on his phone, looking bored. "Ron," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a guy in aisle 12. He's creepy, like really creepy." Ron sighed, putting his phone down. "What's he doing?" "Just standing there, staring at me, and he said something." Ron raised an eyebrow. "What did he say?" Emily hesitated. "He said, 'I've been watching you.'" Ron chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Probably just a tweaker. I'll call security." Emily nodded, relief washing over her. "Thanks." A few minutes later, Ron and Joe, the burly security guard, followed Emily back to aisle 12. But when they arrived, the man was gone. "You sure this is the right aisle?" Ron asked, sounding annoyed. "Yes," Emily said, her voice rising. "He was right here." Joe scanned the area, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. "No one's here now. You sure you didn't imagine it?" Emily's stomach sank. "I didn't imagine it. He was real." Ron patted her shoulder. "All right, let's check the cameras tomorrow. For now, just stay near the front." Emily nodded, but the unease lingered. The next morning, Emily, Ron, and Joe gathered in the security room to review the footage from the previous night. "Here's aisle 12 at 1:07 a.m., Joe said, rewinding the tape. The footage showed Emily stocking shelves, glancing around nervously. But there was no one else in the aisle. "Wait! That's impossible," Emily said, leaning forward. "He was right there." Ron sighed. "Emily, there's no one on the tape." "I'm not crazy," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I saw him." Joe rewound the footage again, slowing it down. Still nothing. "Maybe it was a trick of the light," Joe suggested. Emily stared at the screen, her stomach sinking. She didn't know what to believe anymore. That night, Emily sat on her couch, staring at the TV, which was playing a sitcom she wasn't really watching. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message. Unknown number. "I'm still watching you." Emily dropped her phone, backing away from it like it was a live wire. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but the apartment was empty. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her voice shaking. A week later, Emily was back at work, still on edge. She avoided aisle 12, sticking to the front of the store where the lights were brighter and the people were closer. But no matter where she went, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And then she saw him again. He was standing at the end of aisle 12, just like before. His smile was wider now, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You can't hide from me," he whispered, his voice raspy and low. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. "What do you want from me?" she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped forward, his movements unnaturally smooth. "You'll see," he said softly. That was enough to break the spell. Emily turned and bolted, running toward the front of the store. She burst through the doors, gasping for air. Ron and Joe ran after her, their faces filled with concern. "Emily, what's wrong?" Ron asked, grabbing her shoulders. "He's here," she cried, her voice shaking. "He's back." "Who's back?" Joe asked, looking around. "The man in the hoodie." Ron and Joe exchanged a look. "Emily, there's no one here," Ron said gently. Emily turned back to the store, her heart pounding. Through the glass doors, she saw him, standing in the middle of aisle 12, his smile stretching impossibly wide. "I'll always be watching," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily screamed. Epilogue. The security footage from that night showed Emily running through the store, her face filled with terror, but there was no man in the hoodie, no one else in the aisles, just Emily, alone. She quit her job the next day and moved to a new city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But no matter where she went, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And sometimes, late at night, she would see him, standing in the shadows, smiling that unnatural smile. Because sometimes, you're not alone. The man in the parking lot. The supermarket was quiet at 1:05 a.m., the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh, unnatural glow over the empty aisles. I clocked out, my footsteps echoing against the tiled floor as I made my way to the employee break room. Ron, my manager, was sitting at the table scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I walked in, his brow furrowing with concern. "You sure you don't want me to walk you to your car?" he asked, his voice low. I forced a smile, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's just a random weirdo, Ron. I'll be fine." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "That guy from last week. I don't like it. You shouldn't be out there alone." "I'll be fine," I repeated, grabbing my bag from the locker. "It's just a parking lot." I wish I had let him come with me. The parking lot was dimly lit, the flickering streetlights casting long shadows across the rows of cars. My footsteps echoed against the asphalt as I walked, the cool night air sending a shiver down my spine. I clutched my keys tightly, the jagged edges digging into my palm. And then I saw him. He was standing near the back row of cars, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlight. The man in the hoodie, the same one from aisle 12. My stomach dropped. He wasn't moving, just watching. I forced myself to keep walking, my heart pounding in my chest. "Don't run, don't show fear." I repeated the words like a mantra, trying to steady my breathing, but with every step, the feeling of dread grew stronger. And then suddenly, he took a step forward. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He took another step, faster this time, and then another, and then he ran. I didn't think. I just sprinted toward my car, my keys jangling in my trembling hands. The sound of his footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder with every second. My heart raced as I fumbled with the keys, struggling to find the right one. Come on, I muttered, my voice shaking. Finally, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, he slammed against the window. I screamed, my hands flying to my mouth. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. His grin was too wide, too unnatural, like a predator savoring its prey. And then, slowly, he reached into his hoodie and pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the dim light, and my blood ran cold. I didn't think. I just started the engine and floored it. Tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, the force of the acceleration throwing me back against the seat. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the shadows. The next night, security checked the footage. I sat in the security room with Ron and Joe, my hands still trembling as they rewound the tape. The screen showed me walking through the parking lot, my pace quickening as I spotted the man. "There he is," I said, pointing to the figure standing near the back row of cars. The footage showed him following me, his movements slow and deliberate at first, then faster as he broke into a run. My stomach churned as I watched myself fumble with the keys, the man slamming against the window just as I started the car. But the second I drove away, he vanished. One moment, he was there, standing in the parking lot, his face pressed against the glass. And the next, he was gone, like he had never existed. "What the hell?" Ron muttered, his voice trailing off. Joe rewound the footage, slowing it down frame by frame. But no matter how many times we watched it, the result was the same. The man disappeared into thin air. I quit my job the next day. Ron tried to convince me to stay, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that unnatural grin, those unblinking eyes. I moved to a new city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Epilogue. Months passed, and I tried to convince myself it was over. I found a new job, a new apartment, and tried to rebuild my life. But the memories of that night haunted me, creeping into my dreams and waking me in a cold sweat. And then one night I saw him again. I was walking home from work, the streets quiet and empty. The flickering streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. I turned the corner, and there he was, standing at the end of the street, his hoodie pulled low over his face. My heart stopped. He took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. And then he smiled, that same unnatural grin stretching impossibly wide. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear him behind me, his footsteps growing louder with every second. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because sometimes you're not alone. Story 3, The Thing on the Shelves. People always talk about weird Walmart customers, the kind of stories that make you laugh nervously, the ones you tell your friends over coffee. But what I saw that night wasn't human. It was around 2 a.m., and the store was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh, unnatural glow over the empty aisles. I was in the middle of a late-night grocery run, grabbing a few things I needed for the week. The store was almost deserted, save for a few employees restocking shelves and the occasional insomniac shuffling through the aisles. I turned into the snack aisle, my basket swinging at my side. The shelves were lined with bags of chips and pretzels, their bright packaging glaring under the lights. I reached for a bag of tortilla chips, my fingers brushing against the plastic, when something wet dripped onto my head. I flinched, reaching up to wipe it off. The substance was thick and slimy, clinging to my hair like glue. Not water. Disgusted, I looked up, expecting to see a leaky pipe or a cracked ceiling tile. But there was no leak. Instead, a man was crouched on top of the shelves, staring down at me. His grin was the sickest I had ever seen. It stretched too wide, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they bore into me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. In his hand, he held a small plastic syringe, the kind you'd use for medicine or cooking. Before I could react, he squeezed it. Another splatter of thick white liquid hit my shoulder, cold and slimy against my skin. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He just kept grinning, his eyes never leaving mine. I screamed. I don't even remember dropping my basket. I just ran. My feet pounded against the tiled floor, the sound echoing through the empty aisles. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I found an employee near the self-checkout, a young guy with a name tag that read Jake. He was leaning against a register, scrolling on his phone, but he looked up when he heard me coming. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "There's someone in the snack aisle," I gasped, my chest heaving. He's on top of the shelves. I couldn't finish the sentence. My hands were shaking, and I could still feel the slimy substance on my skin. Jake's eyes widened. "Stay here. I'll call security." He grabbed his walkie-talkie and spoke into it, his voice low and urgent. A few minutes later, 2 security guards arrived, their faces grim. "Show us where you saw him," one of them said, his hand resting on his belt. I led them back to the snack aisle, my heart pounding with every step. But when we got there, the man was gone. The shelves were empty, the only sign of his presence the faint smear of white liquid on the floor. The security guards searched the aisles, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. But there was no trace of the man. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one of them asked, his tone skeptical. "Yes, I'm sure," I snapped, my voice shaking. "He was right there." The guards exchanged a look, but they didn't argue. Instead, they led me to the security room to review the footage. The security room was small and cramped, the walls lined with monitors showing different angles of the store. The head of security, a burly man named Greg, rewound the footage to the time I had entered the snack aisle. "There," I said, pointing to the screen. "That's when it happened." The footage showed me walking into the aisle, my basket swinging at my side. I reached for the bag of chips, and then the man appeared. He dropped down from the top of the shelves, his movements unnaturally smooth. His grin was just as sickening on camera as it had been in person, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched him squeeze the syringe. But the most terrifying part came next. As the man crouched on the shelves, his reflection should have been visible in the glass doors of the nearby freezer. But it wasn't. The freezer doors showed only me, standing frozen in the aisle, my face filled with terror. The man had no reflection. Greg paused the footage, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't go back to that store, not after what I had seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That unnatural grin, those dark, empty eyes. I moved to a new city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And sometimes, late at night, I would see him, standing in the shadows, his grin stretching impossibly wide. Because sometimes, you're not alone. Story 4. The Vanishing Customer. The frozen foods aisle was always the coldest part of the store, but tonight it felt like a freezer. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh, unnatural glow over the rows of frozen pizzas and TV dinners. I was working the closing shift, stocking shelves and trying to stay awake. The store was nearly empty, save for a few late-night shoppers and the occasional employee shuffling through the aisles. I was bent over my cart, grabbing a box of frozen waffles when I noticed him. A man was standing at the end of the aisle, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. I straightened up, my breath catching in my throat. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadows. I turned away for just a second to grab another box from my cart, and when I looked back, he was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the aisle. Nothing. No sign of him. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty store. No response. I quickly checked the next aisle, my footsteps quickening with every step. But there was no one there. Just rows of cereal boxes and canned goods, their bright packaging glaring under the lights. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement in the reflection of the freezer glass. He was standing right behind me. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. No one was there. I ran to the front of the store, my heart racing. My manager, Ron, was at the self-checkout, leaning against a register and scrolling on his phone. "Ron!" I gasped, my chest heaving. "There's someone in the frozen foods aisle. He was just standing there and then he disappeared." Ron frowned, his brow furrowing with concern. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure," I snapped, my voice shaking. "He was right there." Ron sighed, putting his phone down. "All right, let's check the cameras." The security room was small and cramped, the walls lined with monitors showing different angles of the store. The head of security, a burly man named Greg, rewound the footage to the time I had been in the frozen foods aisle. "There," I said, pointing to the screen. "That's when it happened." The footage showed me in the aisle, bent over my cart and grabbing a box of frozen waffles. I straightened up, my mouth moving as I called out to the man. But there was no one else in the aisle. The footage showed me turning away, grabbing another box from my cart, and then looking back. My face filled with panic as I scanned the aisle, my movements frantic. But the strange thing? There was never anyone else in the footage. Greg paused the footage, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't go back to that store, not after what I had seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That shadowy figure standing at the end of the aisle. I moved to a new city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And sometimes, late at night, I would see him, standing in the shadows, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. Because sometimes, you're not alone. Story 5. The Fake Customer. It was an ordinary night shift, or so I thought. The store was quiet, the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh, unnatural glow over the empty aisles. I was working the closing shift, manning the register and trying to stay awake. The store was nearly deserted, save for a few late-night shoppers and the occasional employee shuffling through the aisles. Around 2 a.m., a friendly-looking old man came through my register. He had a warm smile and bought a few small items, a loaf of bread, a candy bar, a bottle of water. "Just a little snack," he chuckled as I rang him up. We made small talk. He paid in cash, took his bag, and walked toward the exit. But as soon as the automatic doors slid open, he vanished. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. I looked around, my eyes scanning the store, but there was no sign of him. "Did you see that?" I asked my coworker Sarah, who was restocking the shelves nearby. "See what?" she asked, looking up from her cart. "The old man. He just disappeared." Sarah frowned, her brow furrowing with concern. "What old man?" "The one who just came through my register," I said, my voice trembling. "He bought a few things and walked out the door, but as soon as the doors opened, he vanished." Sarah looked at me strangely. "I didn't see anyone." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But he was just here," I insisted, my voice rising. "I rang him up. We talked. He paid in cash." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't see anyone, and I've been here the whole time." I didn't know what to say. My hands were shaking and I could feel the blood draining from my face. "Let's check the cameras," Sarah suggested, her tone cautious. The security room was small and cramped, the walls lined with monitors showing different angles of the store. The head of security, a burly man named Greg, rewound the footage to the time the old man had come through my register. "There," I said, pointing to the screen. "That's when it happened." The footage showed me standing at the register, scanning items and talking to thin air. There was no old man, no loaf of bread, no candy bar, no bottle of water, just me, scanning invisible items and talking to no one. Greg paused the footage, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't go back to that store, not after what I had seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That warm smile, those kind eyes. I moved to a new city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And sometimes, late at night, I would see him, standing in the shadows, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. Because sometimes, you're not alone. Story 6. The Watcher in the Parking Lot. It was past midnight when I finally left the store. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars scattered under the flickering streetlights. The air was cool, and the faint hum of the store's sign buzzed in the background. I was exhausted, my feet aching from hours of standing, and all I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget about the day. But as I stepped into the parking lot, I felt it. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. The lot was quiet, the only sound the crunch of my shoes against the asphalt. I fished my keys out of my pocket, gripping them tightly as I walked toward my car. That's when I saw him. A man, standing near the farthest row of cars. He wasn't moving. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I forced myself to keep walking, my pace quickening with every step. "Don't run, don't show fear." I repeated the words like a mantra, trying to steady my breathing. But the feeling of dread grew stronger with every second. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was still there, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into my back. I walked faster, my keys jangling in my trembling hand. My car was just a few feet away now. I could see it, parked under one of the flickering streetlights. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move. I didn't see him take a step. I didn't see him walk. One moment he was standing near the farthest row of cars. The next he was closer, much closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the keys, struggling to unlock the door. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped them, the sound of metal hitting asphalt echoing through the empty lot. I scooped them up, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the doors, my hands trembling as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I flipped on the headlights, the bright beams cutting through the darkness. He was gone. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart racing. I scanned the parking lot, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. But there was no sign of him. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. "You're tired, you're stressed, it's nothing." But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. The next day, I told my manager, Ron, about what had happened. He listened patiently, his brow furrowing with concern. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "It was probably just some weirdo." Ron nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "All right, just be careful, okay? And let me know if you see him again." A week passed, and I tried to put the incident out of my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped into the parking lot, I felt that same prickling sensation at the back of my neck. And then, one night, I saw him again. It was late, just like before. The parking lot was empty, the flickering streetlights casting long shadows across the asphalt. I was walking to my car, my keys clenched in my fist when I felt it. That same overwhelming sense of dread. I looked up, and there he was, standing near the farthest row of cars, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I forced myself to keep walking, my pace quickening with every step. But no matter how fast I walked, I could feel him getting closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was closer, much closer. I didn't see him move. One moment, he was standing near the farthest row of cars. The next, he was just a few feet away. I broke into a run, my keys jangling in my trembling hand. My car was just a few feet away now. I could see it, parked under one of the flickering street lights. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I flipped on the headlights, the bright beams cutting through the darkness. He was gone. That was a month ago. And even now, when I'm alone, I still feel him watching.